Hello, welcome. What we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be looking at creative writing, and we're going to be looking at using description in your creative writing. We're going to go through the real basics of just using description, and if you're not very good at it, or if you feel like you need a little bit more work in it, then this is the video that you need to be looking at. So just looking at really building up from the basics, and then we're going to start working towards some more advanced types of description towards the end. Okay, so let's just start with using description. It needs to be effective, and I'm going to highlight this word right now because it needs to be used for a reason. When I say used for a reason, the philosophy is, or the way you should be thinking is that I'm describing this for a reason. So if I'm describing a tree in my story, for an example, then I need to have a reason for describing that tree. I'm not just doing it because I need to fill up a bit of space or to fill in a bit of a passage. I need to say that I'm describing the tree. Why? Because it's an important tree in a story. And I know that might not seem like it might seem a bit weird if I talk about it that way, but it needs to have some sort of focus in the story. If it's just to say how beautiful the scene is, then that's why it's there. So you need to use it for a purpose and be effective with it. All right. And more importantly, you must also realize the value description has. It's the reason your marker will care about it. Now, this is about using description effectively, but also giving it some sort of value, which means that not only do you have to say that this description is really telling us something, but that's adding value to my story. It's making something that I want to read. Okay, so those are the two things to think about before you even think about adding any sort of imagery or adjectives or descriptions or anything else like that. Okay, it's just simply starting with those 2 points of view. That first of all, it needs to have a purpose, it needs to be effective, and it adds something. Okay, so that's what we're going to really look at when we're starting this. You need to be an effective communicator, and this is one of the other big things, is that writing stories is not about describing a whole heap of things, having a brief sort of storyline and then going, that's it, I'm done. What being an effective communicator is all about is what I'm writing is what needs to be written. I'm saying what needs to be said, and I can prove that. And from my story that I've written, I'm showing how well I can communicate my ideas, how well I can tell a story, get you involved with it. So it's about being an effective communicator. All right, let's start with probably the most obvious technique, which you would have come across a lot and you use yourself, which would be imagery. Now, it's the most common technique of the story, right? It's the most common form of description because it's all about what we see. It includes the figurative and literal descriptions. I'll just define what these are now. Figurative description, or we'll start with literal actually. We'll start with the literal because of the fact that literal is pretty much as we see it. So if I'm describing a door or a house, I'm describing it as it is, as it looks and how it appears. If I'm describing it figuratively, I'm not describing it how it appears, I'm describing what it sort of feels like or looks like. So the door might be like a giant mouth opening up, the house might be an acne on the surface of the ground or of the countryside. It could be any of those things. It depends on how they're being described, and it creates a sort of image, because when we think about those two things, we think about it in a way that really sort of gets our imagination going, and we start to picture it, start to visualize it. Even those last two ones for figurative, you can sort of imagine this house with this big mouth sort of sticking out on the landscape like a pimple on a teenager's face, those sorts of things. It is one of the things you look at to start with. Anything that describes something can be classed as a form of imagery as well. So what you'd be looking at is that you're describing things visually. When you're describing something in its visual sense. So anything like that is a little bit different from sensory language in that you're describing something else about it, which we'll go into it a little bit later. But what you're looking at is anything that's visual. And we're really looking at the visuals because the visuals are obviously the primary way most of us communicate. Is that we see things first, that we react based on what we see before we sort of react based on things that we hear or smell or anything else like that. Visuals are a strong thing and a strong feature in your writing, and that's not to say that you ignore the other things, but it's still an important feature to have. Using imagery requires you to identify what descriptions need to be shown. So it's like what I was mentioning at the beginning when I was talking about the reasons for having a description. You need to show what needs to be shown. So like I was saying before, you need to say if there's a house or tree, if I'm describing that landscape, I need to have a reason for doing that. If it's just to tell us where we are and what we're doing, fine, do that. If it's just there because I need to fill in some description or I want to add something that sounds really lovely, well, again, it depends. If it's just there to sound lovely, and doesn't really add anything and doesn't really engage anyone in any sort of way. It's just description for description's sake, and you get rid of it, ignore it. If it has a purpose, if it's, as I said, to establish a scene or to show how beautiful something is, then okay, put it in there. That works fine. Again, it's just about being very selective, and it's about choosing the right kinds of imagery. Now, imagery also allows you to be sort of the form of a camera, in that if you imagine it like a film, and I know many of you probably watch more films than you do read books, so it's pretty much the process of using a camera, and the camera shows us what we are meant to see. So a director or a cinematographer, under the advice of a director, points a camera at what they want you to see, and that what tells the story in the way that they want you to be able to see it. In other words, it allows us, as not only the audience, but also as the makers of films and as the creators, so to speak, to show what we like to show. For instance, if we're looking at it in terms of a bad guy, we need to paint him that way. So we focus on giving him the descriptions that point to him being a bad guy and nothing about him being good. For instance, if I gave him a scowling smile, withered and pointed teeth and heavy brooding eyes, those sorts of things which are quite symbolic of an evil character, what I'm doing is not only describing him in a particular way, but I'm describing it in a way that says, hey readers, hey audience, this guy's evil. It's doing it for a purpose. It's not just describing him to say what he looks like, it's describing him to say he's evil as well, and that we shouldn't trust him, that we should dislike him, all those different things. I mean, if we were trying to paint someone as being the villain, like in that image, we wouldn't talk about the charity work they do with lost dogs, or the work they do for the RSPCA, for instance, because we're trying to show that they're evil, not... If we're saying they're evil with a heart of gold, yeah, sure, show that. But if they're just plain evil, then you wouldn't show any good characteristics of them. You just show the bad stuff, and you make them almost pantomime. It's about choosing what sorts of descriptions you put in and why. Common sense, basically.